Interview with Dennis E. Condon of 4556 Comanche Drive, Okemos, Michigan, 48864. Denny's phone number is area code 517-332-8732. The recording was made on February 10, 1992 by Jim Walkinshaw at the Oldsmobile History Center at 4000 North Grand River in Lansing. This is tape number 1 of 3 tapes. Okay, Denny, if you would just start with your name and your address and your phone number for me.
This is Denny Condon, and I live at 4556 Comanche Drive in Okemos, Michigan. My phone number is area code 517-332-8732.
Good. Now take us back to when you started and what you were doing.
Okay. Well, I started working for Oldsmobile in September of 1953. I had graduated from Michigan State in June. I was scheduled to go in the Air Force, and for some reason at the last minute they canceled my order, so I went looking for a job. And because my wife was still attending Michigan State, I wanted to work in the Lansing area, so I went knocking on doors. And I had interviews with 3 or 4 companies, including Rio and what was the Motor Wheel and
Duplex, maybe?
No, the other one was the aerial photography company.
Oh,
Abrams.
Yeah.
Abrams and Oldsmobile. And at the end of the process, looked like the Oldsmobile looked like the best job opportunity, and so I decided to come to work for Oldsmobile. I started on September 3rd, 1953. The first group I was in was the transmission group, where Andy Watt was transmission engineer. However, this was at the end of the Korean War, and so I never did work on transmissions, but what I worked on was a 30-millimeter machine gun that Oldsmobile was developing at the time for the Army and for the Air Force.
All right.
And I hired...
It was a 30-millimeter.
30-millimeter machine gun. A big, well, that's big for a machine gun. No, it wasn't like a cannon.
Yeah.
But, you know, Oldsmobile had been in the munitions business during World War II, and so during the Korean War, they had worked on these machine guns for the Army Ordnance and the Air Force. And my first job was as a senior detailer, and they started me out at $400 a month, which was pretty damn good in 1953. But
so you were on the board?
I worked on the drafting board, right next to Tom Krieg, who was just out of Angola, and we were working on detailing parts to this machine gun.
How many guys were doing that?
Well, the machine gun group was probably maybe 7 or 8. Harold Howard headed up the drafting group for the machine gun. Ken Favor was like the senior engineer on the machine gun development, and then Andy Watt was the overall head. And I did all kinds of design studies in that. And the interesting thing, again, helped through some of the build-up of the guns, and I went down to proving grounds several times where they had the firing range down at the Milford Proving Grounds to test them. But the interesting thing was that I was still scheduled to go into the Air Force. And so I talked to Andy Watt one day, and I said, Andy, why don't you write me a letter to the Air Force telling them that I've been working on this machine gun, and when I get in I didn't have an assignment in the Air Force yet, and when I got in the Air Force, the chances, you know, maybe I could get to work on this gun. Well, I went in the Air Force in June of '84. I'd worked almost a year, and I got my orders to go report into the Air Force. Andy wrote the letter. I got married in June. My wife and I took off for Sampson Air Force Base in New York, got out there, reported in, and by gosh, there was a letter out there addressed to Lieutenant Condon saying, ordered me to go to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And so they cut my orders. I went to Wright-Patterson, and I became the project officer on this 30-millimeter machine gun for the Air Force as just a lieutenant right off the street. But because I'd had the experience working on the machine gun as a draftsman, a designer, junior layout man, that Andy's letter got me the job as the project officer. So I spent 2 years in the Air Force working on this particular machine gun, adapting it to B-47s and B-52 bombers. It was a tail gun on those planes, and really really enjoyed. You know,
we never made it, did we?
No. Shortly after I went in the Air Force, in fact, Oldsmobile gave up the engineering contract that they had, and it went to an outfit called Buffalo Arms in Buffalo, New York. And so while I was in the Air Force, I had very little contact with Oldsmobile at the time because they had gotten out of the machine gun business. But it was one of those rare cases where things seemed to fit together.
That's really unusual.
I spent 2 years in the Air Force, got out in June of '54, came back to Oldsmobile, and they didn't have a job that I wanted. And they wanted to put me in the lab, and I didn't want to go in the lab.
This is like the outdoor party?
This 1956, I mean. No, this was in the engineering. In the engineering lab. You know, all engineers were supposed to start down in the lab. Well, I had been on this machine gun in the Air Force. I was first lieutenant, and I just didn't think I wanted to come back and start in a lab. So I told GM that I wasn't going to come back, and I went to work for General Electric. And Andy Watt was in the process of forming the Advanced Design Group at that time in engineering. And I'd been to GE about 3 or 4 months in Holland, Michigan, and I got a call from Andy one day and said, "Denny, I think I've got a job that you'd like now. Come on over and talk to me." So I did. And by gosh, if he didn't have a job that I thought I'd like, and so in December of '56, after working for GE for about 5 months, I did come back to I quit, came back to Oldsmobile and started working for Andy Watt in the Advanced Design Group.
So was that the birth of the Advanced Design?
Yes, that was when Andy first started the Advanced Design Group.
All right.
And so I started work back on December 1st of 1956. They gave me my length of service back to September of '54. Yeah, they did, which was very nice of them to do that. But I worked, started out working for Ken Faber. He was kind of head of the engineers that were in Advanced Design. Jim Dawson hired in about that time. Gary Long came in short time later. Frank Ball spent some time in Advanced Design. And then I think Jack Wallace came up from Experimental. He was kind of my boss toward the end that I worked in Advanced Design. But I was in Advanced Design from about 1956 through 1963 was when I moved up to the chassis group.
What were you doing?
Okay, the kinds of projects at that time, the things we were trying to do were things like get rid of the big hump in the front floor for the transmissions. And what we were doing, we were splitting the transmissions, and we were making transaxles, which essentially put most of the transmission at the rear of the car, rear axle. They were transaxles and had just maybe the torque converter up front. And this was you were able to reduce the size of the tunnels, put most of the tunnel for the transmission in the trunk rather than in the front floor. And we spent several years working with the Tech Center. Oliver Kelly, if I remember, was down at the Tech Center at that time. And you know, these were still when automatic transmissions, in the early '50s, automatic transmissions were still under development, all kinds of things going on. So we worked on transaxles.
What do you think precipitated that need?
Well, it was just a need to try to get more room in the front. Rather, you know, transmissions were getting huge at that time, and the automatic transmissions took up one hell of a lot of the front floor in a car. So with a rear-wheel drive car and a transmission in front, you had this big hump up there. So you really had about a 2-passenger front seat. So the first approach was trying to move the transmission to the rear, or as much of it as you could. One of the interesting things working on those transaxles was when we came up with the idea of a rope prop shaft. And I don't remember you ever... Pontiac in 1962 or 161, when the new little F-85 and Pontiac, whatever they called the car, Pontiac was the one who finally took it into production, but the original rope shafts were developed here at Oldsmobile. And we worked with Saginaw steering gear because, again, with the transmission in the rear of the car, you didn't have the high torque. So the torque was not multiplied until the rear of the car, so you could use this little 3/4 inch diameter flexible shaft between the flywheel and the torque converter, and the axle in the rear. And so that gave you a real small tunnel. And Pontiac did go into production. You remember the date of '61. That was when we were coming out with the first F-85. Nothing ever went into production at Oldsmobile off of any of that early work. Let me just trying to think. At that time we were working on new independent rear suspensions. None of those ever came out. But that was also at the time Oldsmobile started working on front-wheel drive. And in the very early stages of that, I think it was John Belts who said, Andy, we need to have a front-wheel drive car. So I can remember Andy going out and buying a Cintron and it was that French car that wasn't a very attractive car, but it had front-wheel drive, and we took it out and drove it all over Lansing, and we were just amazed at how good it was on the wet roads and the snow and things like that. And then Jim Dawson was the primary engineer in advanced design who was working on front-wheel drive at the time. And of course that eventually led into the Toronado, those early studies, and there were a whole series of prototype cars built up, experimental cars, and that was in the late 50s and early 60s that Jim was working primarily. One of the things that I worked on at the time, I started to get involved in trying to measure the structural properties of vehicles and that, trying to see what it would take to really get our cars so they wouldn't shake, which was one of the major problems of body. When you had separate body frame cars with body mounts, we never were able to get very good ride qualities in those cars. And so I worked on a project to measure through the body mounts the forces that were being transmitted from the body to the frame. And as a result of that work, that got Ralph Perkins' attention in the chassis group. And I had instrumented a series of cars, and I tried to show Ralph how the different shapes of the body mounts should be, because you should have lateral control here or 4.5 here. Well, I think Ralph was favorably impressed. And shortly after that, he came down to Andy and said he wanted to see if I couldn't come up to the chassis group. So I moved from advanced design up into the chassis group about in '63, I think, was when I moved up there.
Now the advanced, excuse me for interrupting, Denny, the advanced design group could just wander most any direction it needed?
Well, we did, except, again, as a project engineer, I don't think I was in too much of the planning on that, but obviously Andy was getting some pretty strong direction out of John Belts and Harold Metzel at the time. I mean, this was when, Harold Metzel was chief engineer. John Belts was one of the assistant chief engineers, and I think Andy worked for John Belts. During that time, those early years from 56 through 63, those were great years to be working in the auto industry. I mean, obviously there was no foreign competition. Our competition was more our sister divisions even than it was the Ford or Chrysler at the time. And again, early on, you don't see all the things that are going into the design of the products and that. But with the work that I was doing, I was out on test trips. I did have a chance to meet Wolfram on test trips and Harold Metzel's, and I always thought that was pretty good, to be able to be out away from the plant and doing development work. We used to go out to Phoenix very early on with some of our experimental cars, because they would be in the shows that were held out there, the current model development work. They'd always have the advanced design cars out there to show people what we were working on. So I got out on test trips to the desert proving grounds, and we used to go down to New Orleans, pick up with the chassis group going down to New Orleans. We'd go to Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Did these folks work on styling it like these?
No, we didn't.
You didn't work on any of that kind of
No. Most of the things that advanced design did, we never put in. We just put in mules and things like that. I mean, we just buy a car, and we'd put all of our gadgetry and everything underneath it, and we never really styled bodies to go along with the stuff. And I can't remember any project we had in advanced design where we had a styled car.
So it's basically under the skin.
Yeah, right. And in fact, like, you know, I think all the early front-wheel drive cars were in some American Motors cars that they were producing at the time. It was just the right size. The body was the right size for what we were working on. And so there were a lot of those running around. Remember the name of it. But
So you went up to the chassis bunch.
up the chassis bunch. It was in around '63, and I was the suspension engineer on full-size cars. And so, and along with that, front and rear suspensions, body mounts, engine mounts, all the things that that went into what they called tuning the ride of the car. And I started out working for Jim Diener up there. I'm just trying to remember something. Back when we were in advanced design, I remember one particular time we were out at Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we were going to pick up Jack Wolfram and his party at the airport with about 3 or 4 cars that some of them were experimental cars, others were just current production. But this must have been about probably around 1960, maybe 59, 60, something in that era. And Andy was out there, and he said, well, Andy, when Wolfram gets in there and gets off the plane, you go out there and you take the luggage and everything and get it in the car, and then we'll get them into the cars and get them in. Well, the plane lands, and the party starts to get off, and Jack Wolfram is walking right toward me, so I walk right toward Jack, and then we had one of those proverbial, do you shake hands or salute type thing. And I reached for his bag, and he put out his hand, so I pulled my hand back, and then I put my hand out, and he pulled his back. And we did that for about 3 or 4 times, and I often thought that was, you know, one of those situations where you, and he just laughed, Wolfram. I mean, I never really knew him that well, but he was a very stern type of guy, and he was always, it just seemed like he was always business. There was never any time when you didn't see him that he wasn't all business. But he even broke up and laughed at our little situation there. There were other things about those test strips, but I guess I'll just pass those by for now. But back at the chassis group, again, early on, we were working on new front and rear suspensions for the full-size car. Through that time frame, 63 to about 74, that was 11 years that I was in the chassis group. And over that time, again, I did a lot of structural analysis work on cars, bodies, frames, and things like that.
Did Olds basically have a way they wanted the car to?
Yeah, I think each of the car divisions at that time all thought they had their own type of ride qualities that they were looking for.
What were we trying to achieve?
Well, generally, I think at that time, that would have been, well, I guess that was when Harold Netzel took over as general manager and John Belts was chief engineer. When I started, it was about that time they became the driving forces in engineering. And Belts always looked for a real soft, quiet type car.
Okay.
And so everything we did through all the time that he was the chief engineer, they were really big, soft riding type cars. And we tried to do that in the full size, our F-85 Cutlass lines. That was always what we were reaching for. And because of that, our cars had probably more shake in them than some of the other cars. They were softer, quieter, but they were shakier. And so that was always a trade-off that we were working on in the ride development area. And we were trying to make our cars. There was, believe it or not, in the early '60s and there were so many things about the handling of a vehicle that people really didn't understand what made a vehicle handle the way it does. And I can remember it was in those early '60s, or in the '60s, that I first met Don Nordine and Tom Bundorf, who were working for GM Research at the time. And they had developed some very, very good analysis of what the characteristics were of vehicles in handling maneuvers, wind disturbances, and they had developed a whole series of formula that were able to describe the performance of a car. And then that's when we really started to understand the nature of understeer and oversteer and what it took to really make a good handling car in terms of the suspension characteristics, the tire characteristics that you needed. And it was over that period of maybe 5 or 6 years, the last 5 or 6 years I was in the chassis group, that we really got a handle on those things. And so we were in the process of changing our suspensions to agree with a lot of the analytical work that Don Ordine and Tom Bundorf had done down at GM Research. And lo and behold, it was all right too. I mean, it was all correct. I mean, the things
prior to that, Denny, it was seat of the pants?
Well, we did it because of some very fundamental basic formulas for suspension geometry, what suspensions had to do. We knew some of those kinds of things. To make a car go straight down the road, you needed caster and camber, but we really didn't understand what the nature of the tire properties and how they developed at the road surface and what the ultimate effect was on a car. So a lot of that work that we did in those times was really redesigning our suspensions to answer those kinds of problems. And I think that was when we really developed an understanding of the handling of an automobile.
Did you guys, as chassis folks, spend a lot of time in cars running around?
Oh yeah,
proving ground?
yeah. Well, see, that was another thing about working in the chassis group. If you were doing ride and handling development, you spent probably better than half your time in cars, driving cars. I mean, and we not only went off on the test trips, which again, in the wintertime, we'd always go south so that we had good roads to work on, and in the summertime, we'd come back and work in Michigan. But those years of the 60s, I really didn't probably spend as much time with my family as which I should have been at that time. I had 2 daughters, and but I also, those were that was my job to, and so we did do a lot of. We spent half our time in cars.
Well, on test trips, what kinds of things would you do?
Well, like for example, in terms of the components that are in an automobile that you would use to tune your ride, you obviously had all the rubber parts that were in a car. You had all the bushings on the suspension bushings on the control arms. You had all the body mounts, and there were anywhere from a dozen to 18, maybe 12 to 18 different body mounts on a car. You had the engine mounts. You had the sheet metal mounts. You had a whole series of bushings, the durometers of the bushing, all of those kinds of things, plus all the shock absorbers, shock absorber valving. I mean, that's the stuff we worked hours and hours on doing shock valving. In fact, one of the best guys I ever worked with was Clyde Morgan from Delco Products, and he was the Delco Products shock absorber engineer who was assigned to Oldsmobile. And of course, Clyde, he went off on all our test trips with us, and he was really probably one of the best ride engineers I ever saw. I mean, in terms of using shock absorbers to tune the ride of a car. And so,
would you change things as you traveled?
Oh yeah. See, we'd get into an area, and if it looked at a series of good roads on it, well, we'd rent a garage. We'd rent a hoist in a gas station, and then we'd just work out of a gas station, and we'd make all these changes, do all these tuning things to our car to make the car feel good on the roads in that area. And then we'd go on to another area and do some more work, and we had spots throughout the country that we used to do ride development work. I mean, like New Orleans was a place the guys used to go always down at Mardi Gras time.
That's right.
They'd go down and pick that up. I remember Floyd Sullivan found a place down in Jackson, Mississippi. Ralph Perkins had sent him south one time and said, "Find us a new place to work, Floyd." So Floyd found a place in Jackson, Mississippi. We worked in Savannah, Georgia a couple of winters. In the springtime, we went down to Louisville, Kentucky, and we worked out of Louisville. Of course, that was about Derby time that we'd work in Louisville. We worked in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Of course, out of the desert proving grounds. Los Angeles. One of the problems on our cars at that time was called freeway hop, and the cars would get into a resonant beaming or bending vibration as you drove the Los Angeles freeways, and that was a function of the spacing of the cuts in the freeway, tar strips, but also the concrete surface itself was in a scallop. And our cars would get in that, and at a certain speed, it would just make the cars shake like mad. And so cars had to be tuned for a LA freeway hop. And when John Belts was general manager, John always liked to go out to New York City and have some kind of a media show. And it wasn't necessarily with his new cars. He just liked to go out there and he'd have a session with the media out there. Well, we ended up going out and working our cars in New York City. Belts would be out there for one of his media get-togethers, and then we'd go out and work the cars, and if we had the cars tuned, then John would put a big show on. He'd invite them in for lunch, and then he'd show them the cars, and he'd drive them around Manhattan. But we actually worked on the Henry Hudson Parkway in New York City, because again, it was a very unusual road surface that the Henry Hudson Parkway developed, and what the response of the cars to that. And the interesting thing was that when they were going to put the new ride and handling facility out at the Desert Proving Grounds, which was in about maybe 70, well, it was 74, 75 in that time frame, all the engineers that did car development work, ride development work for the corporation from all the divisions, we all got together and we all described the various roads that we had used throughout the country. And the GM Proving Grounds sent their instrumented vehicles out there, and they measured all these road surfaces throughout the country, and then those were the actual road surfaces they constructed out at the Desert Proving Grounds. And if you go out to the Desert Proving Grounds on the ride and handling loops out there, they've got these sections of road, maybe a quarter to a half mile long, and they represent some 50 different road surfaces.
Like these freeways that you found.
Right. And there's a section out there at Desert Proving Ground which is labeled Henry Hudson Parkway, or at least it's on the charts. You can see that it is. But there are all of these road surfaces that were put in out at the Desert Proving Ground. That was after I was no longer in that.
Did you guys pay any attention to what the writers like for Tom McHale and those kinds of guys would write about vehicles?
Well, that's an interesting question. Probably very little.
Very little. I was always curious about that.
I remember one of these rides that we had in New York City with a whole bunch of writers that Belts had rounded up. And when I found out that none of these guys owned cars, and that they all put their leather gloves on to get in and drive the car, and they drove it, and they really didn't know anything about cars. And that, now I'm making a generalization, but out of maybe 25 writers, automotive writers that Belts was meeting with, that there were half a dozen who didn't know anything about cars. That disappointed me, and so I never really put much faith in him when I found out he didn't even own an automobile. Well, in New York City, you don't own automobiles. I guess. During that time period in the chassis group, some of the guys that worked with me or for me at that time, of course, Floyd Sullivan, Tom Rasmussen, and myself, the three of us were pretty much the ride and handling development people. Tom on the Toronado, Floyd on the Cutlass and F-85s and Cutlass, and I had the full-size car. So the three of us were more or less the ones that did the ride development work, and we either worked for Jim Diener or C. Schofield at the time. And as we added more car lines on, we brought more engineers in. Some of the other guys that worked with us then or for us, Dick Coleman came in, and he was a ride development. He took over my job more or less on the full-size car. Ivar Arms came in. Ed Schelling was up there at various times.
Did you try to keep a car line with an individual?
Yeah, that's what we did, usually for at least a couple of years, because it took a while to really get to know the car and what it took to make the car what the bosses wanted. Well, what our objectives were. But Dave Caldwell worked in there, and Jack Voorhees also. So there were a group of maybe 10 over the time that I was in there were maybe 10 engineers or so that were involved in ride development work on our cars.
Any computer stuff at that juncture?
Very little. Very little at that time. Now, they've done a lot of that, and they've got a lot of that now on computers, and they can do a lot more simulations.
Yeah.
But at that time, Ralph Perkins' old philosophy was that this was the artillery method. It was one over, one under, one on. It took 3 moves to know, to get what you want. And I don't know how many. There are millions of combinations of shock absorber valving, and there are thousands of combinations of body mounts, and so to do all the ride and development work, you did have to spend a lot of time, and it was all cut and try. And everybody had a little different feel for what they wanted to see in the car, and hopefully, it's like any organization. Ralph Perkins was a chassis engineer, so anything we did, he had to say was okay, and then before he'd show it to his boss, and before they'd go up the line. So, and those were really those were interesting years. They were
Okay, you were getting involved with all upper management.
Okay. This is, I think, the first time I used to sit in the regular meetings, the monthly design reviews with the GM management and the car division management, and I got to know Pete Estes and Jim McDonald, and first time I met Roger Smith was on a test trip out to Phoenix when we were riding 78As and 80X cars, and I spent the whole day riding shotgun for Roger Smith in an 80X car that day. I wasn't even in a 78A. Some of the things we did during the 78A development program, this was when they had the board of directors shows, and of course they still have the board of directors shows, but again, once a year, all the new programs would present their programs to the board of directors, and it was a full staged 3 projector, 20 sound. I mean, it was a really big shoe that we used to put on for that. And when we were going to we did the 78A, I think we did it twice. One year when we were pretty well along in development, and I think the next year we did it when we had all of our models and everything there. But I remember, again, Ed Mertz he could put words down on a piece of paper, and you'd have a slide that would go with it. And we put together, I thought, were some very excellent board of directors show. But the highlight was when we used Becky, and I can't even think of her last name right now, but it was Ed's secretary, and Becky we used as a model to demonstrate the station wagon tailgate that we'd come up with, and everybody had said you can't use people in those board of directors show. They don't like that type of stuff. Well, we decided we were still going to do it, and so we had everything written, the script done, and all the slides and everything, and we went out to the proving ground to give our first dress rehearsal out there, and I don't remember, I think it was Howard Carroll. Howard Carroll was over all the engineering staffs and that, so he was the one that we really had to sell that day. And so we went through our pitch, and then when Becky came out on the stage to demonstrate the tailgate, I was watching Howard Carroll all the time, and he just kept getting a bigger and bigger smile on his face. So I knew that we had a winner, and so they let us go ahead and use Becky as to demonstrate the tailgate in our little pitch, and I really thought that ours was the highlight of that board of directors show. Well, after that, then everybody started using all kinds of people in their shows and that. But in the board of directors shows kept getting better and bigger, and using more of all the audio visual stuff that you could do. And again, that was a period. Again, I don't even know whether they still have a board of directors show. But after the project center experience, when I was back in product planning, again, product planning back at Oldsmobile was responsible for putting together Oldsmobile's presentation for the board of directors show. So I had a chance to work on a couple of those. Yeah, and we did some pretty good ones. And Fritz Bennett's He was always amazed at what we could come up with for, and I remember we put one together for Fritz, and I don't remember what year. I think it may have been the 1980 model year Board of Directors show, which would have been in the, summer of '79, and that was when Magic Johnson was the #1 sport topic in Michigan, and somehow we wrote a paper for Fritz. We wrote his copy that included Magic Johnson in it, and some clever things about now you see it, now you don't, what's really right. And if I remember correctly, Mike Workman also had a 9 projector set up that year, and we did an opening thing for which Fritz Bennett's did, which just drove everybody crazy for what we could do. And if I even remember correctly, I think Bob Cooks, I think the general manager usually reviewed his car line for the board of directors, and I think even Bob Cooks that year was a pretty good one. But just that was, yeah. But that's the thing that project centers did. I mean, part of it was show business, to show the corporation what we were doing, what the products were in that.
And a lot of coordination.
Oh yeah, a lot of coordination.
And a lot of shooting ruffle feathers, or not?
Well, no. Again, I think Ed Mertz had the ability to keep people from getting their feathers ruffled. Just one of those unique individuals. And you see, again, by this time, I'm really not involved much in engineering anymore on the cars.
Completely outside.
Yeah, right. And right now I'm in planning, more than anything else, more in managing an overall program. This is the first time I have an opportunity to see a total car program from the concept phase through the definition of all the dimensions. I mean, actually doing the packaging of a vehicle, then seeing design staff do the clay, do the very early renderings, and then go to the clay stage where you start to see a car come together, and then you've got to put all the engineering, all the body sections, everything in there so that the car can be made according to the clay, and of course it doesn't always work that way. But it was in this time that you really have a chance to see what it takes to design, develop, and manufacture an automobile. Mm-hmm. And again, that's one thing I think I was very fortunate to have maybe the last 10 years or so that I worked for GM, to be in this area of overall vehicle development and management, to see the total thing. And again, at this time, you're starting to get a lot of the marketing inputs to what it takes to produce, or to what kind of a product do you want out in the field 5 years from now, when it took us 5 years to go from concept to production.
There was a fair amount of that kind of discussion going on.
Oh yes, right, all the time. And after spending that 2.5 years at the 78A Project Center, I came back, and I was going to be the assistant body engineer, and I was assistant body engineer under Tom Krieg for about 1 month when they promoted Ted Lucas, who was product planning engineer, to assistant chief, and so I took over Ted Lucas's job down in the product planning department. Okay. And now, believe it or not, I've come full circle, because what was the product planning department at that time really was the old advanced design group, because over the years the advanced design group, less and less of the advanced design stuff was being done at the car divisions. More of it was being done back at engineering staff. And so advanced design had evolved into the product planning department. Okay. And after Andy Watt retired, it actually changed its name from advanced design to product planning. And Ralph Perkins took it over, and he was product planning engineer until he retired. And then I think after Ralph, may have been when Ted Lucas took it over, and Ted Lucas was product planning engineer, and then I came back and was product planning engineer.
But now you weren't doing all of that early engineering of unknown subjects now.
Well, no, except now the product planning department at Oldsmobile at that time we were then responsible for inputting into the project centers all of Oldsmobile's requirements. So I was still dealing with the project centers that were in place, but now rather than responding to the car division's inputs, we were responsible for inputting into the...
This is how the car specs basically got to the project.
Right. Was each of these product planning groups in each of the car divisions, we were the ones now developing what we called the level 1 specs, the response to the marketing needs, and feeding those into the project centers and letting the project centers develop the level 2 specs, which is actually the design and engineering of the vehicle. And so that's what the product planning department was at that time in Oldsmobile. Of course, we're still a full car division, and we still doing everything.
Now, did you have the product, the level 1 specs had to have input from sales?
Oh yeah,
marketing
right,
and
right.
all that
Yes,
stuff.
right.
So somehow you had to.
Yes.
Were those people part of your organization?
No. Quite often, no. There was still the sales department, the marketing department, Lynn Myers and that group of people over there. They were inputting into the product planning department all the marketing analysis, marketing needs that they did, and then we were more or less trying to interpret those needs into a set of level 1 specs that we could give to the project centers and design staff and whoever else. And of course it went the other way too, into the manufacturing community. This was before, I think they use the word synchronous engineering now, but at simultaneous, we were calling simultaneous, but we were trying to get to the point where before you ever put a line on a piece of paper, the marketing, engineering, manufacturing, everybody had an input to what you were going to put down on a piece of paper as the level 1 specs for a car.
Now, was that different than what had happened 15 or 20 years prior?
Well, it probably wasn't, except it was a more formalized procedure now. You had, well, it was at the point where we were starting to get these PDTs, product development teams. I mean, it was just prior to the reorganization. Some of these things were just these concepts of management, and they were just being developed. But it was still project centers pretty much through the 85 NCAR. I was just trying to think if that was the last project center.
You had the new the W car.
Oh, okay, the GM10.
Yeah.
GM10 was still a project center
right.
car, right. Yeah, you're right, that was.
Long after that.
Right, that was.
But prior to all of these things, where you were doing all of this, how did that same information get handled 10 or 15 years prior to that?
Well, I think, see, I guess I can't really answer that question, Jim, except I know that the influences of the chief engineers back in those days was damn important.
Was it more so then than it was in later years?
Yeah, because, see, I think what happened, what seemed to happen to me in GM was that these project centers, the personality of the chief of the project center became more influential in that product than the inputs of the chief engineers from the car division.
So it was his vision that turned into the vehicle almost.
Yeah, and again, maybe other people may not see it that way, but I really do feel that that's what happened to that era of project centers.
Okay.
And the car line chief, the car division chief engineers had less and less influences into what the product, and the project center chief engineer really may have been more of a controlling factor in it. And that again...
well, that's an interesting view, because something happened in there.
It did. And again, you know, the progression from the UPC group, design responsibility, into the project centers, and now into whatever this...
whatever you call it.
They call it the synchronous engineering. There is not a project center per se anymore that I can see. I mean, you don't have a program manager or a project center like we did in the mid 70s to mid 80s. It is a different organizational structure that they're using. But the product, at that time, the product planning department in each of the car divisions, when I was back in product planning, I think we did have very strong input into the project centers.
Okay.
And again, the product planning department was working with the general manager of the car division, who had the final say on every styling item, and the chief engineer, and again the regular design reviews at design staff. They
You
were.
must have been there pretty much during the duration of Cook. Then, Bob
Yeah,
Cook.
yeah. That's I think
The Bob
from
Cook era.
pretty much from the project center through Bob Cook's retirement. I was in either the project center or product planning or the body group, and I had a lot of work with Bob Cook, and appreciated back when I was in the chassis group was the first time I ever came across Bob Cook, and Bob Cook was one of the production managers out in manufacturing someplace. I didn't know exactly where, except I knew somehow he controlled what spring changes could be made in the plant, and I don't know exactly why Bob Cook controlled that. I don't think he was ever in materials management.
Oh yeah.
Oh, was he? Oh, well, then.
Materials management there for several years.
Oh, well, then that's why.
Yeah.
But
He was manufacturing manager.
okay, well, you see, I never could quite understand, because that's the first time I ever met Bob Cook.
Yeah.
Was, you know, you'd get into production on a new model, and I always tended to put the spring loads on the high side, because the production bodies always seemed to come in heavier than what we thought. And so I was always gambling that when we got into production, the cars would be carrying right.
Yeah.
The carrying height would be right. Well, I got trapped a couple of years, and that was another thing. John Belts, he could read a quarter of an inch in rocker height to ground. I never saw, looking at it, he could see whether a car was high or low to what he thought the spec was. And you know, that was, I used to just shake in my boots when we'd have all the cars lined up out at Phoenix for the final buy-off. And by God, I know the car was high, and I would just hope that Belts wouldn't see it, but he would catch it. And so, Denny, you got to get the carrying height fixed on those cars. Well, that meant a whole spring lineup change, which in terms of, once you've gone through a spring lineup, there may be 20 front springs and 10 rear springs, and they're all ordered based on the volume of the cars, the equipment on the car. I mean, it's tremendous logistics to get that whole spring program. And then Belts would say he wanted that car lowered a quarter of an inch in the rear. Well, you had to change the damn spring tables, and that would just throw the materials management people for a loop. And every time I had to have a spring change, I had to clear it through Bob Cook. And I can remember getting him on the phone, and he'd yell at me, and he'd swear, and he'd say he wasn't going to do it. And I'd just say, well, if you don't do it, Belts is going to be complaining about the carrying height. And then finally, somehow, in the system, they would make the change, and they'd do it. But that was the first time I met Bob. But he was general manager. Of course, that was an interesting thing, because after John Belts died, of course, Howard Carroll became general manager. And then after Howard Carroll, there was a guy by the name of Baker.
Who was here for about 2 months. Yeah.
Okay, and that must have happened about
that was in
74?
Yeah, in December, November, December.
See, I was thinking, because I never met this Baker, and normally he would have, normally the general manager would have been out at Phoenix in the fall when we were working on the next year's cars. And for some reason, after Howard Carroll moved up to Corp, and that Baker came from Canada, wasn't it, GM of Canada?
Right.
And he was only here for a short time.
Yeah.
And then he passed away, and Bob Cook became.
Right.
Okay, well that's okay. So Bob Cook was general manager then, when I started down at the project center, and then Bob Cook was general manager through 83 then.
Yeah.
So he was general manager for 9 years. Okay. Well, so during most of that time, I was either project center, product planning, or the body group, and Bob Cook was.
Did Bob have some those unique requirements that he wanted with vehicles himself?
Well.
Or did he kind of ride with the flow?
Well.
Because we were having really good years in there.
We had wonderful years. We had wonderful years. Bob Cook was he had certain concepts that he wanted to see in a car, and he knew what they were, and he knew when design staff wasn't giving him what he wanted.
Okay.
And he was always able to get design staff to finally give him what he wanted. Now, it was kind of a funny thing. I mean, design staff didn't like to put vinyl tops on cars. And Bob Cook would say, vinyl tops are what sell these cars. I want vinyl tops on all my cars. And before it would be all over with, he'd have vinyl tops on all his cars. And he did that on a hell of a lot of the design features of the car. Cook was not a John Belt. John Belts could see cars, and he could see lines on cars, and he knew exactly how he wanted the car to look. Now, I don't think Bob Cook could do that, but whatever design staff showed him, he knew whether it was going to sell or not. And so, although he couldn't tell design staff, do this, do that, he could always see what they had done, whether it was going to sell or not. And I think that was an ability that very few general managers had. And so, yeah, I think Bob Cook deserves one hell of a lot of credit for Oldsmobile's million car sale years. And it was his ability to get design staff to finally see things the way he wanted them.
Did design staff not want to do those kinds of things?
Oh,
Buck traps
oh yeah, they did. They just, Bob would want a chrome line here.
Yeah.
Design staff wouldn't give it to him. And then he'd keep asking for it until finally they'd put it on there.
What did they not do?
Well, see again, design staff occupies a very unique position within General Motors. Yeah. And again, I don't know whether it still does that, but design staff marches to their own drummer. And depending upon who was head of design staff, and again, over the time that I knew him, Bill Mitchell, I think, was the first one that I knew down there. And then I think it was Earl Revicki.
Yeah.
Okay, and then Charlie Jordan is now. They haven't, see, that head of design staff is a pretty long-lived or long-lived job.
Yeah, and he works for the bunch down there as contrasted to working for the car division.
Right. Well, but see, every car division has their own studios down there. The studio heads in that work for design staff. They don't work for the car division general manager.
Johnny Perkins, who's down there, doesn't work for...
Doesn't work for, well, Bill Lane. Which reminds me, Bill Lane, of course, is Oldsmobile. I'm just going to put that down here again. He was... well, it is unique because design staff carries one big stick in the final property of the cars. Engineers can show them what can be done, but design staff is always making you reach. They're always trying to get you to give them another millimeter here or two there. They want flush glass. You know, they want the car to be a little lower. They want, and they're always, and they're challenging. Maybe that's the word. They're always challenging the engineering community to think beyond the traditional and see if they can't get to the next level of engineering that allows them to come up with something new in shapes and lines and things like that. And that's good, I think. And a general manager, though, is supposed to be able to have overall say for the products coming out of his studio, and yet, you know, design staff doesn't always listen to general managers. They don't always listen to chief engineers, or and they sell very hard on their ideas, and you've got to work with them a few times to see how they can take a clay model and whatever they want, they can make that model look just beautiful, and then they'll give you the alternative over here done in clay, and it's screwed up one way or another. There's something a little bit wrong that doesn't look nearly as good as what, and you know, so yeah, you know, and it's not only salesmanship, it's some cases it was actually cheating. but it is an interesting, and it probably isn't as simultaneous as synchronous, or it isn't done in that sense, and yet generally I think I don't think GM has been a particular style leader over the years, but I think we've always come along and been able to execute themes in that better than anybody else was doing at the time. And I never really, I guess over my years, I never really felt that GM was a style leader. We were always good at executing the themes that were being developed by other things. And you know, and design staff claims they they're not just thinking about cars when they're working on cars. They're thinking about all the other products and things that people are using, and they try to take all of that and integrate it into the design of the automobile. And in a lot of cases, they do. But there also are some examples that I think they are absolutely wrong. Their use of electronics was absolutely wrong, and we tried to tell them they were putting too many buttons, too many gadgets, and they insisted on doing that. And really, for the last 5 years or so, I think some of our instrument panels and things like that, they're just nothing. They're a disservice to a driver's ability to drive his car and to control things. Well, again, you know, there were some things that I think were absolutely wrong, and I was as guilty as anyone, because at the time I had some responsibilities in those areas, and I kept telling those guys at design staff that all those little small buttons and all those little words, you can't push a button, you can't operate a control, you got 30 of them, you can't see, you can't read which one is which. So there were a lot of things that I think design staff really did not understand the use of some of the new technologies, and because there are some things they could have done with the electronics that they didn't do, and maybe we'll get back to it. I think, like, for example, the new 92, 98 instrument panel, new full-size 88, 98 instrument panel, a hell of a lot better than what we've had for the last couple of years. Larger buttons, bigger words. I mean, just those little things, better reach controls. They've made some improvements, but they've still got a ways to go. Of course, all this time that I'm in the project centers, back at product planning, Bob Dorshemer is chief engineer, and Bob Cook is general manager. Yeah. And these are the last 10 years or so of my career at Oldsmobile, and they are challenging times in terms of what we were trying to do. And they were some of the best years in Oldsmobile's sales history. Yeah. And I think we all felt very good about that, because I think generally the products we were putting out were pretty damn good cars. They still had some problems, but our customers were generally satisfied with the products that we were putting out. You don't sell 1 million cars a year unless you've got good products to put out there. But this is also the time the Japanese are moving in, and the competition is becoming fierce. And I think.
Now, did we see that in our, like in your organization? Was that?
Yeah.
Was that apparent?
I mean, let me cite an example, and it had to be back. It had to be back in the early '70s. And I remember we went out and we got a half a dozen Japanese cars at the time. Toyota, Datsun, Hondas. I don't remember all. A couple of them we got were even right-hand drives. We weren't even able to get left-hand drive cars. But we had a half a dozen or so cars that we brought into engineering to look at over a week. And then we were going to have a ride on the Saturday afternoon. We were going to take the cars out for a ride. And that had to be, well, see, it had to be probably late, early 70s. It had to be 71, 72, somewhere in that time frame. It was before the energy crunch. It was before the October '73 war. Fuel was not a concern, but there was this. These guys are coming down with these products, and so we got them all, went over them, and in general, they were not very good, except for the Toyota. And here was a car, wasn't even being sold in the United States yet. I think it was a Toyota out of Japan. It had some of the best fit and finish, coach work, design. The design itself wasn't good, but the execution of the design was unbelievable. And I told people at the time, I said, I don't understand how they can get all these fits and how everything just goes together. Their plastic work was absolutely outstanding. And I said to myself, I said, my gosh, somebody here's got something. They're doing it differently than anybody else I've ever seen. Somehow they're building a car a lot better than anything I've ever seen. And that had to be in the early 70s. And it was funny though, because at that time we were having a serious, I remember now, again, it must have been late 60s, we were having a steering gear problem. And on the ride and handling loop down at the Milford Proving Grounds, if you did a brake stop on the chatter bumps, we could actually twist the steering shaft off of our steering gear. And it was manual steering, and we still had manual. So again, this had to be late 60s or so. But the thing was, is the car got into a resonant wheel fight condition on these chatter bumps, and it was so violent that it would actually snap it didn't snap the pitman arm, it snapped the steering shaft off the gear. I mean, you lost control of the car. And I don't remember how, we never had that happen in the field. To our knowledge, we never had a steering gear fail in the field, like we could get them to fail in the proving ground. But after we found that condition, this resonant wheel fight, then we started testing all of our cars. We'd put them through this test just to see what happened. And power steering cars wouldn't fail, but the manual steering car would snap. And I think that was because of a little smaller shaft. But after we started doing this, then we started running a whole series of cars through this test. And these same Japanese cars that we'd had in for an appearance analysis and that, we ran them on this test. And the front ends actually disintegrated on this same resonant wheel fight condition that these smaller Japanese cars at the time, they came apart. They just tore, self-destruct when we ran them to the test. And everybody said, oh my God, those guys are a long way from, but again, it was in a very unusual test condition.
Which apparently doesn't happen.
Well, it doesn't happen much, but we were sure worried about that condition when we found out what it was.
History interview with Dennis E. Condon of 4556 Comanche Drive in Okemos, Michigan. The recording was made on February 10th, 1992 by Jim Walkinshaw at the Oldsmobile History Center in Lansing. This is tape number 2 of 3 tapes. Okay, you're back on.
Okay. Again, during the chassis group period, 63 through 74, this is where I got to know John Belts, Howard Carroll, Bob Dorshemer.
Would you be close to
Well, the thing about it was when you were off on these test trips, that's when you were riding with them, and it was really it was different than what it was when you were back in the plant.
Okay.
But when you were off on the test trips and you were working with these people were riding the cars, that was a great feeling to be able to be participating in that type of thing.
Would they be sort of like one of the jokes?
Oh yeah, it was. I mean, that was, well, not only from the work standpoint, but everybody was living out away from home, and you were having dinner every night together, and just palling around in that sense too. So it was a chance to get to know these people. Mm-hmm. And I think another interesting thing, I think the first year I got a bonus may have been 1963 when I got a junior bonus. I think it was a total of 8 shares of GM stock. Yeah, something like that. But I remember I was out. Must have been in the spring of '64 that I was out at Phoenix working on car development, and I got a call from John Belts, who evidently was assistant chief that year. He may have been chief engineer in that. But I remember I had a call to return John Belts' call, and hell, the guy never talked to me much before, I thought maybe I was in trouble, but he called and said, Denny, I want to tell you, you're going to get a bonus this year. Well, that always made you feel good when you found out you were finally eligible for a bonus. And then someplace in those 11 years I worked in the chassis group, I also became eligible for the senior bonus. And again, those were very, very big points in your career, was when you'd reached a point where you were on the senior bonus. And so that happened during that time period. Also, getting your first company car. I mean, when you became a senior project engineer in product engineering was when you got a company car. And of course that happened sometime when I was still in advanced design. But I think, you know, maybe those 3 points in your career, getting a company car, junior bonus, and senior bonus, those were pretty damn important milestones in your career in Oldsmobile engineering. And it meant that you know, that you were being recognized for what you were doing, I guess. Mm-hmm. And so just a couple of things about John Belts. I mean, there was a man that I think most of us who were working in that area, we just thought that guy, he could do nothing wrong. Mm-hmm. And he was the kind of guy you'd just work your tail off to get one good word out of John. And I can remember on a couple of our trips when we demonstrated our whole line of cars, and he'd walk up afterward and he'd put a driver on your shoulder and say, "Oh, that's a good bunch of cars, Denny. You really got some good ones there." Mm-hmm. And that was a great feeling. And you know, he was criticized because he was foul-mouthed, and I don't know how many people had talked about that, but you know, there were very few sentences that John would speak without you know, a few of the favorite words, but he was the kind of guy that you would just do everything for. And I remember the last time he was out to Phoenix, he was dying from cancer, and this had to be in the late, well, it may have been 73, 74, yeah, sometime in that. It was just before I left the chassis group, but we were out to Phoenix in the spring when we do our normal next year's model review of all the final final ride and everything on the pilot cars. And John Belts we were out on the inside the oval track out there, the circular track, and it was an appearance analysis type thing. And we had all our cars there, and John was so weak that he really couldn't walk, and so he sat on the hood of a car, and somebody drove John slowly around, so that he could see what the cars looked like and from all different angles and that. And it was a very, very sad day when we wrapped it up. He still says we thought everything was in pretty good shape, and that's the last I had seen of John was that. And so I just always remember that afternoon when we were out there and he was being driven around on the hood of a car to see that. And again, I don't remember when John passed away, but was it in May of
so it would have been that year, probably.
May of '74, possibly. That I think that may have been. Of course, Howard Carroll was chief engineer. He was chief engineer at the time, and Howard and I never. we had some unusual situations, but I always remember one that we had, and again, it may have been that year or the year before, when we had the cars all pretty well wrapped up, and we had demonstrated them to Howard Carroll on one day, and John Belts was coming out the next, and we had demonstrated the cars, and Howard Carroll, everybody thought they were real good, and that night we were kind of having a summary meeting back at the Safari Motel in Scottsdale, and here the cars had all been bought off, and by gosh, if Howard Carroll didn't want us to make another frame change on one car. I think I lost my temper or something, but I said, "Howard, you don't change the car the night before the boss is out here to ride them. Aren't you satisfied with what we've got?" And I guess it was one of those things that it may have been good or bad, but we didn't change the frame that night, and we did demonstrate the cars the next day to Belts, and the Belts was very happy with what we had. So it was just one of those things that sticks in my mind as.
See, Howard was a transplant, kind of.
He'd come up from Chevrolet. He'd been in there a couple of years as assistant chief, and then he had gone to chief engineer when Belts moved up to general manager.
Did people view that as kind of how did they view that?
Well, again, I guess I don't really know. You know, I mean, we always felt I think at Oldsmobile you always felt you would get promoted from within. everybody in Oldsmobile seemed to move up from within. I mean, that's what it always been. And I think Howard Carroll was one of the first, top-level outsiders to come into Oldsmobile that I can remember. It seemed to happen a lot more after that. But up to that time, most things had been promoted within. Howard Carroll was a good engineer, and Howard Carroll, I always looked at him later on as the conscience of General Motors. And again, from later on, when he was at corporate headquarters, and I had associations with him when I was on the 78A Project Center, Howard Carroll always had a great sensitivity to what he thought General Motors should be in that, and I think he was maybe many years ahead of his time in terms of the sensitivity of the corporation to the needs of their customers or the country or anybody. Yeah.
That's interesting. Somebody should have listened, maybe.
Well, yes. Yeah.
The period in there when you were in the chassis group, coordination with other divisions was starting at that point in time?
Oh yeah,
that's that a subject.
That's an interesting part, because it was during that time that in the engineering side of the house, or even most sides of the house, they split the car up into these. What the hell did we call them?
Groups.
Well, the UPC groups had always been there, but what happened in each car division, each nameplate car division at that time, which were full car divisions, they all picked up particular areas of the car that were going to be their specialties. Okay, and in Oldsmobile at that time, the areas we had steering systems, which was including both the linkages and everything, as well as steering columns. That was one of our specialty areas. Chevrolet had suspensions, Buick picked up brakes and exhaust systems. Everybody had their own engines at the time, but the rest of the car was divided up into these specialties. And if I remember, Oldsmobile had fuel systems, fuel and exhaust. That's right, Olds had fuel. Did we have exhaust too? Okay, fuel and exhaust, steering systems, and I think those were the only two areas that Oldsmobile really had design responsibility. Well, if Dorshimer was here, I probably wouldn't say this, but I always thought that it was Dorshimer who said, the least we take, the better off we're going to be, because we can get our job done with a lot fewer people. And I often, maybe this should be edited out, but I mean, it'd be interesting to, too bad Bob Dorshimer couldn't say. I don't know whether that was a conscious thing, but it seemed like Oldsmobile had the least amount of design responsibility in terms of what was going on at the time. And of course, again, those were the years of catalytic converters, meeting all the MVSS standards. In the ride and handling area, we didn't have too many to contend with. But a lot of the engineers at Oldsmobile that were working in those areas, they were just, that was night and day type stuff to get it.
How did you do that, the coordination?
Well, okay, those were done at design coordination meetings, and on a new car line. Again, I was trying to think of a year that may have had an all new frame chassis under it.
Well, the 64 F85 was a brand new.
That was all brand new, and I think we were UPC group design responsible about that time, and so you had these coordination meetings where Oldsmobile would be doing the steering systems for those cars, and we'd get the other car divisions together, and everybody would have their input into the design. But it was Oldsmobile who had to go back and actually execute the design, develop it, test it, prove it.
For everybody.
For everybody.
So
right.
If Pontiac wanted some little dinky thing different, you accomplished that too.
We tried to. Not all that we always did, because again, we were supposed to be standardizing all the things that we could that didn't matter. I mean, and so most of the suspension, steering, brake, fuel, exhaust, all of those things were pretty much common throughout all the car divisions on a particular car line. And then there were variations. If it was a full frame job, then you could have variations in the body mounts. There were the tuning items that each division was able to have their own specific parts on. But it was the beginning of this standardization.
And do you have a feel for what precipitated that?
Well, I gotta believe that it was the attempt to improve our designs and productivity by concentrating and getting it down to a few parts. You know, it was the thing that I think led into some of the body panel commonization projects that were in the late 70s and early 80s, when all of our cars got to look alike on the outside. And so, but the first attempt in that area were on the things that didn't show. And generally, those were pretty good products. I mean, as far as the mechanical components and things like that in those cars, I think we were in pretty good shape at the time.
But everybody had their own engine, basically.
Yep, people had their own engines. That was before the engine commonization.
Yeah.
But so at that time, everybody pretty much had their own engines, but everything else, and then everybody had their own basic body panels, except, you know, you'd have your own specific IPs and trim, and then there wasn't too much sharing. There was sharing of glass and things like that,
Okay.
but you still had your own specific hoods and fenders and quarters, and
So it looked different. Yeah.
And then through that time period, in the late 70s and that, we got into where we were too common on the outside, so that we lost some of the differentiation. But I think that was also the time of the becoming aware of the competition, not only Ford, Chrysler, but the Japanese and Germans, and you know, starting to respond. Of course, it was again the downsizing thrust and the fuel shortages in
But that early 70s.
early 73 was the crunch, and that's when every car division wanted a small car, a mid-sized car, a big car, and a specialty car. So what happened was a tremendous proliferation of models by each car division. Every car division got into every market segment, and so the corporation was turning out one hell of a lot of cars that looked alike, because the marketing divisions, the car divisions, were asking for a model in each of the price segments to be able to remain competitive. And again, it was a period, I think, where we were responding to what we thought were the market needs, and so we've gone away from that, though. I think now we're doing a little more specializing, and each car division is not in every market segment. So there's trying to do some of that. No, I just, again, those, I've got to say that, you know, for my 34 years with GM, that third from 63 to 74 may well have been the most interesting, and that was when you know, you felt you were a part of this big corporation, and yet Oldsmobile was a very significant part, and we had this great reputation. We were stuck out in Lansing, but by God, we were the guys that were doing the advanced thing, getting the things that we really wanted. It was a good feel. This was still the time of the big announcement shows, and that the late 50s, early 60s, those were all still where we had our annual show. And I remember you know, going to the auditorium and seeing the Mighty O. I think was one year was the Mighty O, and there were what, 3 or 4 years in there, I think, where Florence Henderson was the star of the show, and that was great stuff. I mean, that was a part of the industry, and
But it went away.
It went away, and you lost what I thought was an important part. But again, I think you know, as important as the automobile is, it's just one of the thousands of products that people now need, and it's not as big a part of a person's life as it was, a part of our culture as it was back in the 50s and 60s. So over that time period, there was this. It just wasn't quite the thrill to get in that first new car every year. That was another thing. Being in engineering, we always had a chance to be in the new cars for about 2 years before they were ever out to the public, and it always gave you the feeling that, well, okay, you know, you're doing something, you're creating something new, you're making something new. Some of that may not make sense now, but at that time it seemed to make sense. Okay, I think that covers my first 18 or so years, I think, with GM. In the fall of 1974, Dorschmer called me in one day and said, Denny, there's a new project center starting up down in Detroit, down at the Tech Center, the 78A. It's going to be the downsizing of the Cutlass, the mid-sized line of cars. The 77 full-size cars had been downsized the year before, or it was in process then in 74. That project center had been up for a year, and Ed Mertz was going to head up this 78A project center, and he wanted me to go down and talk to him and see if I'd be interested in being one of his assistant chief engineers down there. And I know he told me this just before I headed out to Phoenix, and I was going to be out to Phoenix for a couple of weeks on a ride development trip that fall. But he said, as soon as you get out there, call me back. I want to know, you've got between now and the time you get out to Phoenix to think this through, a day to think it through, and let me know what you're going to do. And so I called him back when I got out there and said, yeah, I'd take the job. I thought that it sounded like an interesting one, and I got down.
Did you go to Detroit to talk to Mertz?
No, I didn't even go down and talk to him first. Well, it was one of those things. Well, Ed Mertz had been up. He'd come up to Olds for a couple of weeks before, the first time I'd ever met him, and he'd given a presentation to the engineering department about this new 78A project center. He was telling what they were going to be doing in that. So it wasn't as if I had some background on this thing.
So had the project center stuff started prior to that?
Well, Ed was just getting the 78A organized. Oh yeah, the 77 BC had already been organized, and it was in operation, and I forget who was heading that one up.
Had we used it prior to that?
No. That was the start of it. That was the start of the project center. The first project center was on the 77 full-size car, and of course the 78A was the second, and then the 79E was the third, and then you had the 80X. I mean, that whole series of cars from 77 through about the 80. When was the end car? Is that 84, 85? 85 end car. Okay, that whole series of cars from 77 through 85 were done in the project centers. And again, Chuck Brady, who was, he had been previously director of the Milford Proving Grounds, he became head of what was called current product engineering down at the Tech Center, down under the staffs at the Tech Center. And I think it was more or less Chuck Brady's concept of these project centers, because he was the head of all the projects. The project center chief engineer reported to Chuck Brady, and he was kind of like he was kind of neutral from all the other car divisions, but the 78A was starting there in the fall of 74, and after I told Dorschmer, yeah, I'd take the job, it was only a couple of weeks later that I reported in down there, and
so your activities moved to Detroit.
Right. Then from 1974 through early 1977, I guess it was, my assignment was actually down at the Tech Center, and we started out in the Chevrolet engineering building, and eventually we moved over to another building. But for that 2.5 years, I worked in Detroit just every day. And
did your group then, was it an amalgamation of people?
Oh, yeah. What the project center was then was Ed Mertz was the only one, I think. Oh, he worked for engineering staff for Chuck Brady. Most of the other people in the project center were on loan from their car divisions to the project center. So even though I was moving down to the project center, I still worked for Oldsmobile. I mean, my paycheck was from Oldsmobile. And most of the rest of the staff of a project center were like myself, on loan to the project center for whatever time it took to get that project underway and developed. And so But the Project Center was not a large organization because, again, the car division still had their UPC group design responsibilities, but the Project Center was in charge of integrating all these different groups into, we'd spec out what the car had to be, we'd do the initial, what you might call the phase zero part of doing a new car program, and we'd do the level 1 specs for the car, and then each of the car divisions still had to, their engineering departments had to do the actual design and development of their UPC group responsibilities.
Who would have given you then the input about here's what an Oldsmobile should be like?
Okay, the car divisions would do that through, each of the car divisions then had a representative to the Project Center. They were like their liaison people. Plus, Ed Mertz, as the chief engineer of the Project Center, he had monthly meetings with the car divisions. These were from the chief engineer through 2 or 3 different levels within each of the divisions, plus the corporate staffs. Each of the Project Centers reported on a monthly basis to this GM management team like. And this was where you would get your inputs, I mean not all of them, but you'd get a lot of the inputs into the program from these top level meetings. And
otherwise you'd end up with 5 cars that all looked alike.
well, no, you wouldn't, because again, each of the studios over at design staff, they are involved in the early stage, playing up the models.
So that input is coming too.
Right. So the Project Center was spec'd out most of the engineering background to a new car.
All right.
And then design staff would execute the specifics over that for each car division. And again, the general manager and the car divisions are having direct inputs into design staff so that the car looks like what they want it to look like. And then the engineering groups are each inputting to the Project Center to make sure that the car behaves, handles the way they want it to.
Kind of the underside of the
Right.
car.
And although that seemed like a very, well, what's the word, complex system, I think it worked. I mean, through that time frame, when those products were developed, for example, the 78A lasted, it essentially lasted for 10 years or better. Well, yeah. When I forget when the last. Well, no, it was even later than that, wasn't it? When was the last?
Was it 87? I know
well, there was a full frame, body mount, separate body, A car, which became the G car, which lasted for quite a while. It was a good. Well, it lasted into.
10 years?
It went over 10 years. That basic car, the 78A, went the longest I can think of any platform lasting in GM, and obviously that platform made a lot of money for GM through those years. But the Project Center, which I was at, Ed Mertz, to me was one of the most impressive persons I've ever met in General Motors. I always thought he had the potential to become president of GM. I don't know whether he will now or not, but he certainly, I thought at one time, had that potential. Which reminds me about Bob Stempel.
Okay.
When I was in the chassis group, Bob, of course, was out on a drafting board. I mean, he was a super designer, and you know, Bob Stempel literally designed the Toronado suspension and steering, and all the really heavy mechanical stuff of the Toronado came out of Bob Stempel's head. And
was it obvious he was going to be something?
I think it was, and you know, he certainly demonstrated on the Toronado, which would have been being designed in 63, 64, 65 in that in that time frame. I mean, he was that kind of a guy. I mean, he was not only a good engineer, a good thinker, designer, but he was also a great people person. And I think his move up, again, you know, I'm going to follow Belts to the top, because I think we all thought Belts was going to go to the top, and I think Bob Stempel was going to go right along with Belts. And he certainly was moving that way until he was around 74, so I think when Bob was assistant chief of Oldsmobile, that they took him down to corporation to kind of handle the emission stuff and that, and of course he just kept moving up from there, and I finally bumped back into Bob Stemple again, I guess, when he was general manager of Chevrolet on some of the programs I was working on later, and it was pretty obvious that he was going to be president, and I think chairman in that time frame. Again, just one of the most impressive persons I've ever met, and Ed Mertz. I've always put Ed Mertz and Bob Stemple on that category. But the 2.5 years or so that I worked at the 78A, although it was hell going back and forth to Detroit, and I stayed down. This was before they gave the guys apartments down along Van Dyke. I had to stay in a motel room, and I lived out of a motel room, out of a suitcase for 2.5 years, back and forth a couple of times a week. My daughters by this time are in high school and off to the U of M, and again, there were some times in there when I probably should have been spending more time at home than what I was doing.
Mixed emotions.
Yeah, but it was all very interesting work. I think the 78A, the product we turned out, they lasted a long time. They made a lot of money for the corporation.
Can you think of any, what I would call, things that happen that are kind of unique in that kind of a system that you can share?
Well,
problems and resolutions and those kinds of things that might have been normal happenstances?
The ability, Ed Mertz's ability to get 5 people who are thinking differently together in a room and talk through something and then come up with a consensus decision and get everybody to buy into it. That was the thing that amazed me. And it wasn't so much, I think it really truly was a personal type thing. It was...
It was almost like a public relations guy.
Well, right. Yeah. That, you pose a good thing, because in terms of the engineering on the 78A, it was a very, very conventional car. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like the 80X car, which was front-wheel drive, a body frame integral. The 80X was the beginning of a whole new series of cars. That's essentially what we've got today. I think the interesting thing, the 80X car didn't last very long. The 82A that we spun off, the 80X has lasted. It's still in production now, 10 years later. But the 80X as such disappeared because of some fairly bad engineering problems that showed up in it. And it's hindsight's 20/20.
Oh,
you look at that, and but in the case of the 78A, it was it was very traditional. Architecture, separate frame, body, and
but it just was
smaller. Yeah. And I think Mertz's ability to coordinate all these different inputs and to come up with something that met everybody's needs, that was, to me, was a marvelous work of management that he was able to do. Mm-hmm. And I think the product itself was pretty good. We never ended up with any serious problems on the 78A car, and it always made me feel good. It was at this time where I really
Okay, there we go.
Well, again, just going back to product planning for a little bit, I was in product planning, I think, from about 1977 through 1980. A couple of projects we worked on, we took an 80X car one time and made a 2-seater out of it by cutting a sedan in half and marrying the rear end of, we took a coupe and a sedan and cut them in half and joined them back together and made a 2-seater. I'll never forget the look on Bob Cook's face when we took it over to the executive garage over at Building 70, and he came down and looked at it. Oh! And
he didn't like it, I think.
No, I don't think he did. He was right. He probably never would have sold.
Oh, I know. I was going to ask you a question. Excuse us for the interruption. You had talked about Dorschimer was your chief engineer for many years.
Yeah.
How was his management, or contrast his approach?
Well, he was another one that I think you just do anything you could for Bob Dorschimer to have him say a good word to you. I mean, he was a lot like Belts in that he was he's just one of the guys, really, is what it was like. And you always felt that you know, you do your job for him, you'd be taken care of. But he always would come in and say, well, what'd you do for me today? I mean, he was like, you know, that other stuff is all past history. Is what'd you do for me today? He was a very smart man, good engineer, and I think overall a good manager too, a manager of people. He got people to do things for him, to work for him. And we went, you know, times in the chassis group, and we went through some really horrendous problems. I remember nodular iron steering knuckles was one problem, and I think oh yeah, we were ready to. And I think Bob Dorschimer may have been, or Howard Carroll may have been chief engineer of Bob Dorschimer when we got into that fiasco, when we went off of all the forged knuckles and into cast nodular iron knuckles. And hell, we found out the fundamental problem. We couldn't use the same tapers that we were using on the forged knuckle because the modulus of nodular was not high, and therefore the damn tapers. We ended up having to change the angle of our tapers in order to get those things to work right. But I just remember those were tough engineering problems at the time, and you guys would work night and day. I mean, some weeks we worked 80, 100 hours working on that problem. Dave Caldwell, I remember, was one of the engineers at the time on that problem. But
did we get those kinds of edicts on it very often?
No, not too often. But again, you say you thought it was Ed Cole's edict that we go to nodular iron. See, that's funny. I don't remember, but we obviously decided that we were going to get out of the forging business. And here all our foundries were capable of pouring this great nodular iron and making all. Well, okay. See, I don't remember that. But again, Dorschimer was the kind of guy you'd just work night and day to get things done. I remember that was when I still smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and so did Dorschimer. And he never had his own cigarettes. He always come in and bum a cigarette.
You would?
Yeah, oh yeah. And then about once a month he'd bring me a pack of cigarettes. He said, "Oh, Denny, I think I've probably borrowed enough of these to give you a pack of cigarettes." That was a hell of a lot of people smoked. But he was always a great guy to work for, and very appreciative of good work. I know when I was in product planning, SAE, the Detroit section, wanted a paper on the 79 E-car development, and Dorschimer did, and they wanted Bob Templin from Cadillac and Lloyd Royce from Buick, and Bob Dorschimer from Oldsmobile to give this paper. And Dorschimer came in him one day and said, "Denny, I got to give an SAE paper, and I don't want to do it. How about you doing it for me?" So I said, "Yeah, I'll put it together." So I went down and made that presentation to the Detroit chapter in Dorschimer's place, really, and there was Bob Templin and Lloyd Royce doing their pitches, and there's a little old Denny Condon up there doing Bob, and it was a good paper. I mean, I had a lot of help on it, and of course he put his final blessing on everything. But I did think it was funny. He didn't even come to that SAE meeting that night.
Was he not what I'll call, quote, a public person?
I don't know. Well, yeah, I think he was. But he was also, I think, Bob was from New York, or he went to Rensselaer, I know.
Yeah, Polytech, right.
Right, and was his wife from the UP, or did he? He always was up north. I mean, he's an outdoorsman. His very untimely heart attack and dying you know, in the space of a couple of months there, Ken Knight and Bob Darshamer both died. And that was in '87, and that was the time that they were asking some of us, would you consider early retirement? And I think after seeing both Ken and Bob die, that was one of the reasons I retired at the time, I think. Notwithstanding the fact that our GM99 project had just been canned when we thought we had a winner, but no, Darshamer was really liked Bob was a good guy to work with, and he gave me my first job as a division engineer. I mean, when I came back and was product planning engineer, when you headed up a group in product engineering, that was kind of like reaching a level that you really had earned your stripes when you became chassis engineer or body engineer or product planning, any one of the groups. Then you were more or less on your own, and that was the way Darshamer let you run your department, pretty much on your own, even though there was an assistant chief engineer.
You didn't get a lot of work.
No, you didn't get no. He thought that when you got to that point, you ran your own show, and that's why I think product planning was just terrific type of job. I remember Kenneth Crandall was the secretary down in product planning at that time, and that was when word processors were just coming in. And in product planning, all the stuff, the presentations that you had to turn out, and all the information. And we just thought that, boy, if we could get Kenneth trained on one of these word processors, it'd be the best thing for that. And sure enough, I think Wang was the first word processor that we got in product planning. And Kenneth went off to school, learned how to use it. She came back, and like her productivity increased 3 or 4 times using that word processor.
It really helped.
Oh, it was just unbelievable what she was able to turn out. And you know, in the planning area, well, you know how it was in planning too. I mean, things are changing all the time, and you've always got this mass of paperwork to keep up to date, and
stay loose.
Yeah, don't get caught leaning. Was the expression, you know. And but I mean, that's, like I said before, advanced design had evolved into product planning, so I was back in an area. We were still working on some projects, not a lot, but doing most of the planning work for Oldsmobile division. Had a chance to do a couple of board of director shows, and then I think it was when Tom Creed retired around 1980 that then I was shifted over to body engineer. And again, within Oldsmobile, the body engineering group was the largest group, and it was the meat of the
That's where the style based.
style, right? All the surfaces of the car were in the body group, both interior and exterior. A large group. That's also when all the well, prior to that, they'd started to do a lot of drafting on computers, but this was at the time when all the CAD-AM was coming on, and the drafting tables were going out the door as the computers came in. And again, when I walk through the engineering department today, and I don't think there's a drafting table out there. And you can remember back not too many years ago, 10 years ago or so, it was still predominantly these long drafting tables that everybody sat at and did pushed a pencil around a T-square or a triangle and a French curve, and that was the designing. And now it's all on computers, of course, and it just doesn't look like the same engineering organization that it was. But when I was in the body group, it was just coming in.
How do people view that?
Well, I think everybody, they were a little concerned, but after people started to be trained and you started to see what their capabilities were, I mean, in the design area, it became just like what Kenneth was capable down in the product planning on a word processor. In the design area, the computers just gave the designers flexibility that they never had, abilities that they never had before. And so I think everybody who got trained on it was very, very happy to pick up the new technology and run with it.
Did you Did anybody that ever resisted and just said, the heck with it?
Well, there were a few like that, but again, I wasn't that close to it. Of course, Jim McCauley was the body design engineer, and so that side of the house, Jim McCauley ran. And then over in the body development area, Otto Kern was assistant body engineer most of the time I was up there, and he ran the development side. And so, you know, again, as you move up, I think you get less and less involved in the day-to-day details of what's going on. But again, the body engineer's job involved a lot of work with Bob Cook and Dorshimer as far as the products that we were working on, and interaction with the project centers, not to the extent that I was down in product planning. Yeah, Styling Studios. We had weekly review meetings down there with design staff, and then the general manager usually came down about every 2 weeks. These were regular high-power type design reviews where you went from studio to studio, car line to car line. The time that I was body engineer, we were working. This was through 80 through 83 probably, and so we were working on 81s through 84s type of car lines there, and those were pretty major surface changes and that going through on those years. And that the 82A was an all new program, pretty much a spin-off from the 80X car. So there was a lot of work being done on that. And
Fisher body, did you?
Oh yeah, I did. Yeah, right. Yeah, because again, the body engineer for Oldsmobile, so much of your stuff was done by Fisher Body actually, and so yeah, I spent a lot of time working with Fisher Body. And
can you share with us how did that work okay?
Well, yes and no. I think I think in some ways people didn't really realize what Fisher Body did until the reorganization. And again, I don't know what all the philosophy, what all the thinking that went into the General Motors reorganization. But obviously, at the time, you had Fisher Body doing, you know, the body of the car, and a major part of the automobile. You had the car divisions having design responsibilities for the rest of the car. Everybody had their own sheet metal and their bumper system. Pontiac, though, had design responsibility for bumper systems, so they were coordinating a lot of the stuff underneath while everybody was putting their own surfaces on. But so you had Fisher Body, you had the car divisions with their UPC group design responsibility, and then you had this big GMAC outfit over here, or GMAD outfit over here, that produced the great majority of the cars. And I think somebody in the corporation decided that was not the way to give total vehicle responsibility to somebody, to have all three of these things being done this way. And so they decided they were going to eliminate GMAD and Fisher Body as entities and put it all under these platforms, which is what BOC Group, LAD, Lansing Automotive Division, became. And in some ways, they never grasped what Fisher Body was doing in these programs, the total amount of work that Fisher Body did.
I mean, it had to be humongous.
It was, and Fisher Body was a humongous place. And so when they decided to get rid of Fisher Body and GMAD, they divvied up those people into the platform people, and in doing so, I think they lost one hell of a lot of this integration that used to go on down at Fisher Body, and it's taken them a while to get back. You know, now if you see the way engineering works now, there's what's the word? We got manufacturing, engineering, and Fisher. Everybody's all together now, supposedly. However, we're not all together. we're all fragmented in terms of where we're located, and so there's one hell of a lot of coordination effort that's going on. And I once had somebody tell me that if you used the word coordination to describe what you were doing, that you really weren't necessary. That if you had the thing organized properly, you wouldn't have coordinators and you wouldn't have liaison people. And I often wonder if the Japanese have all of these coordinators that are supposed to pull these diverse groups together and make sense out of it. And so that's what I don't know that what we had before may not have been the right way to do it, but I don't know that what we've got now is the right way either. And I don't know what other people may have said about that, but I see, and again, since I've been retired, I've been back a couple of times working, and I see this terrific fragmentation even now within the LAD organization between the various groups and how many people you have to get together to talk things through to make a decision. I think you actually get more people together now than what we used to get together to make a decision. So I don't know what that means. And there are rumors that we're going to reorganize again, and I don't know what what that may portend. But that period when they broke up the car division, made it strictly a marketing division, which, except for Cadillac, they finally brought back, and Saturn, of course, is a fully integrated division. So GM is pursuing one thing in one area in two different directions at the same time. You don't know how good that is, but with what we've got right now, you see, this period of 1983 and 84, and that's when you and I were working together under Jim Rucker on this GM 20. I called it a production readiness group. I think that was Bill Larson's program management group. Is that what he called it down there at the GM building? That period after I left the body group and went into this production readiness or program management for the GM 20, which was the 85 N car. That period of trying to make that car get into production and do everything right, that was an eye-opener too, I think, in terms of what it was taking then to move this huge corporation into a production mode. And that, of course, was the time that Bob Dorshemer went to corporation as BOC chief engineer, I think, or director of engineering. Ron Haas became chief engineer of the BOC group, LAD, whatever we called that platform. And, of course, that was when Joe Sanchez became general manager. And there was a period of there, I don't know how long Joe was general manager of Oldsmobile. Was it a year, maybe? Or was it 2 years?
2.5, 3 at the most.
Was it? Okay. That was the period when things were changing, the reorganization. I think I was spending a lot of time trying to think through what a program management effort was supposed to be. That was when we were getting into our three-phase planning, or whatever they called that thing we worked out. A completely different phase of the automobile industry, and it more concerned with the process than the product of how were we going to do our business, how were we going to design and engineer and get these products into production, rather than with the product itself. Still interesting type things, and of course that's when I met you, Jim, and Jim Rucker. I've often wondered, where's Jim Rucker now? Because I know he came back and he managed the Riata program.
Yeah, he left there. It was either the Hamtramck plant or the Willow Run plant get going this
Oh, yeah?
last model change.
Okay. those were the periods when working very closely with Ed Vogt in the financial side of the house, and of course Doug Tracy and Ken Knight in manufacturing. Ed Mertz replaced Joe Sanchez as I guess he was called. What the hell was he called? He was platform director.
Director of the
BOC group.
of everything but the Oldsmobile.
Yeah. Well, yes, that always bothered me because he wasn't even called a general manager at that time.
He was just.
And it was in this time frame again. I'm rambling a little bit, but you know, getting Ed Mertz, being back working for Ed Mertz again. Again, after Ed Mertz was in here, I got out of that program management group that I was in and got into, I called it the GM 120, but we were looking at the next go-around of the J's and N's.
Okay.
And so I worked about a year for Ed Mertz in trying to do literally the level 1 specs for those cars the next time we were going to redo them, and I guess it ended up, well, of course, the new 92. Yeah, the 92N that's in production now is what we call the GM 120. It was the second go-around of the GM 20. And then the J body was also reskinned in there somewhere around 1990 or so, I think. But those were the two programs that I worked on then, trying to define those programs when we thought they were going to be maybe new products. And then it later became pretty sure that they were just going to be like a reskin of the existing cars. So they were not all new. They were just major reskins on the J and N. So that program, under when Mertz was whatever they called them, you know, nobody could understand what a platform was. Nobody could understand what BOC group was. I mean, what the hell's a group? I wrote a paper telling them why I think they ought to rename the BOC group the Kettering Division of General Motors. And I put through what I thought was a very, I mean, these BOC groups, the Flint, I forget what it was. Okay. But everybody had these screwball initials that didn't relate to anything. And so I put this paper together that said, well, first of all, we got to be a division. We can't be a group. A division has independent action. A group is a mob of people. And so you got to call yourself a division. If you're going to be anything, you got to be at least a division. In the military sense, the division is the smallest group that has independent action. Well, that's what it was. Well, later on they did call it Lansing Automotive Division. Somebody picked that up. But my thought was that, you know, we couldn't relate. We were more than a Lansing operation. We had plants in Janesville, Lordstown. Now we got a plant in Wilmington. You know, but to call it the Lansing Automotive Division, it ignores what all these other people are doing. So I said, let's pick some names from our history of General Motors, and let's put some really important names to go with these divisions. Well, to me, the Kettering name would have just been beautiful for the Lansing area, for the BOC group. It described the out front leadership and engineering, and so I thought we ought to be the Kettering Division. I thought the Flint operation ought to be the Sloan, or the Cadillac should be the Sloan Division. I mean, he was the financial guy.
Sure.
And then I forget who I picked out. Who the hell was over it? Well, yeah, maybe it was a Durant. No, maybe it wasn't Durant. Who was the other? Was it Injun Charlie? Who was? There was well, we had another guy in there. But I just thought to me, if we'd put some of our best names against these, what we were calling platforms or groups or whatever, that we've done a hell of a lot better at trying to describe what we were trying to do. And so we would have ended up the Kettering Division of General Motors. Yeah, and you'd still have the Oldsmobile Division, but the Kettering would describe this huge engineering and manufacturing complex. And so now they call it the Lansing Automotive Division. Notwithstanding, I should review that thing sometime, but it didn't go beyond getting maybe the division thing put on instead of the product line. Just to kind of, this was an interesting period there in '86 and '87 when I was working on the GM 120. Mertz didn't want me working for him, and Haas didn't want me working for him, because, well, so they put me under Mike Turney, who was the director of personnel. Now he was the most neutral. He was the most neutral guy of the senior staff level in the BOC group, or whatever we were called at that time. What the hell were we called when we first broke off? We were
platform manager of some kind. JN.
Well, we were the J&N platform, but there was another thing that we were called, and it wasn't. But notwithstanding, the reason. So when I was forming this little program management group that were going to manage the GM 120 program, they decided to put me under Mike Turney because he was neutral, and I could then interact with the engineering and financial with kind of an independence. So that was kind of a funny thing to spend a year or so working on that.
Personnel department.
Yeah, right. I mean, and so, and Mike Turney was a great guy to work for. I had to bring him up to date about once a week, and that was when Dale Daly came to work for me as my assistant, and I always thought Dale Daly was the professional planner. That guy could put anything together, take concepts and put it down on paper, make sense out of it. I happened to bump into him the other day over in Building 40 when I was over there, and by God, if he told me he's still doing the same damn thing, putting plans together for people. I would have hoped that maybe something better would have happened to him. Tom Davis then became chief engineer after Ron Haas left. Ed Mertz went back over to Flint as head of Buick car division. Don Hackworth came in as the general manager of the Lansing Automotive Division, and I think they still call him general manager again, don't they? Yeah. So then, when the GM 120 program did not develop as an all-new car program for the '85 time frame, then we started working on what was called a GM 99 project. And that was the project where we were going to try to do a space frame car to replace the J, N, and L eventually. This was going to be an all-new car that would replace all three of those cars. And the basic concept was do a space frame similar to what the Saturn is, only the next stage of a space frame beyond the Saturn. We got into our definition phase and did an estimate of what it would cost to do this kind of car, and found out that there wasn't enough money to do it, and so that project wound down to the point that it was just we were going to break up the GM 99. People were going every place. That was the time they said, Denny, how would you like to consider retiring? Tom Davis said, oh, I got a job for you back here, Denny. If you don't want to retire, I'll find something for you back in engineering. And like I mentioned before, with Bob Dorshemer and Ken Knight both dying within that very short time, I just said, well, maybe this is something that I really should consider. We went to France. My wife and I went to France for a 2 or 3 week vacation, and while we were over there, we talked it through and decided I'd retire. And when I got back from France, I told Tom Davis I was going to retire.
That was 80.
And that was 87, August of 87, and I retired on the 1st of September in 87 after 34 years length of service with Oldsmobile and the BOC group and a few other groups in the meantime. I think.
Who was the best boss you ever had, Denny, and all that?
Ed Mertz. Yep. And I had a lot of good bosses. I just look back at the bosses I've had, and I've got to say Ed Mertz was probably the best overall. Don Nordine was by far. I worked for Don for a couple of years in the chassis. He was by far the smartest person, best engineer I ever knew. Just really, he was sharp. C. Schofield, you couldn't. I worked for C's when I was in ride development. You couldn't ask for a nicer gentleman. He was that kind. Jim Diener was too. Ken Favor, who I find out is still alive. He's 90-some years old. Did we talk about getting an interview with him?
Somebody, I don't know if it was you or Jim Dawson suggested we do that.
Yeah.
I wrote him on the list.
Okay, because again, Ken, you know, he was a doctor of engineering.
Interview with Dennis E. Condon of 4556 Comanche Drive, Okemos, Michigan, 48864. The recording was made on February 10th, 1992 by Jim Walkinshaw at the Oldsmobile History Center. This is tape number 3 of 3 tapes. Okay, back on.
Again, just some other people that I probably should mention. Len Silk is one that.
Leonard Silk.
Leonard Silk.
Okay,
Len came out of Studebaker. I think Len's about 75 now, still working every day as a contract engineer for one of the groups, I guess for Demmer, working on programs for Oldsmobile. But Len and I, over the years, have come up with a lot of great ideas we've always thought, and Len was a great idea man on early phases of cars, packaging cars and that. He and Carl Joss were just two of the best guys to spade out an automobile, see what it should look like. And there were, well, Dale Tuttle, another one in the chassis group design area, that just great thinkers in that to take ideas and put them down on paper. All in all, you know, 34 years with Oldsmobile, BOC Group. You know, when you get through it all, you say, well, did you make any difference? And yeah, there were times when I think I made a difference.
And the most enjoyable time?
Well,
Was that middle?
yeah, I think the middle period, and even yeah, I think generally, even though there was a lot of pressure during the car development years, getting out to Phoenix, and being responsible for putting 10 or 12 cars in VIP shape with all the things that it would take to do it. And of course, the experimental department, Carol Ely, Art Weedman, Tommy Tompkins is one I hadn't mentioned. He, of course, was experimental engineer for many of the years that he was on. And Jim Lewis, another assistant chief engineer. That these were guys that were damn tough to please, and they were hard drivers. But those years of car development were really great years. And having spent a lot of time out at Phoenix in the wintertime, got to appreciate the West, climbing Apache Mountain, doing some of the things that we got to do because we were out there, Superstition Mountain, I should say.
So you didn't mention Joe Sanchez much.
But I never really worked that much with him. That's, again, several times went over to Buick with meetings with him, and found out he and I were both at Sampson Air Force Base at the same time. Yeah, in 1954, when I went into service, he was in the service at the same time, and we found out that we were both at Sampson at the same time. And of course, his path went many different ways from mine, but yeah, that was one interesting thing about Joe. And so I guess I'll leave it at that, Jim, for now.
Okay.
I think
Well, you did a fine job, Denny.
that pretty
Really appreciate
covers it.
So we'll just shut her off here.